with all the lights on and an LED flashlight. To make new friends. After 2 years of high school, we invited 3 friends to come out to town to go camping. Tim's parents owned a small property, sheepdogs and horses a few miles from the town. We camped for 5 days there in the school holidays. The first night, as what often happens, we sat around the campfire telling stories. I told the story of some of those creepy loners I mentioned earlier, a pair of brothers that lived a few miles up the road from where we were camping. They were rarely ever seen, with a reputation of being creepy, hillbilly hicks. I told them the story of how one night they had tried to cripple my father over him, supposedly stealing their business. They ambushed him at the local weighbridge at night. My father managed to fight both of them off, and my cousin also had a run-in with them by taking a shortcut across their field, only to hear a firearm shot in his direction. My cousin had lied to me before, so I wasn't sure if it was true, but I made out like it was and later embellished their reputation with the normal inbred cannibal type crap city folk expect. On the second night, we decided to go for a night walk. We were kids and enjoyed fantasy movies and games and had a bit of role-playing fun. One of us was too scared to go out in the dark, so on our walk we decided to play a prank on him. We started screaming and running back to camp, saying, "He got Henry!" It worked, and our friend was scared. Zeb tried to climb an electric fence to escape. Henry, came back dirty and bloody, and we hid in a farmhouse until Tim ruined the prank by claiming he heard the brother skinned people, which caused us to burst out laughing. The next afternoon, we hiked up the nearest hill, called Sims Gap Hill. It was a popular walk for Tim and I when we were kids. The fastest way to get to the hill was by taking the dirt road called the Stock Route, which ran parallel to the main tar road which led to the town. The two roads are connected by another called Sawmill Road, which was at the base of the hill. We walked down the Stock Route, and I pointed out the Hillbilly Brothers' property as we went past it. All you could see from the road are piles of rusted old cars. We reached Sawmill Road and walked across the paddock to the hill, and had an enjoyable time. We started climbing down the hill as it got late, but underestimated the time it took to walk across the paddock to the road. By the time we reached the road it was night, and of course, it happened to be pitch black. As we started walking down Sawmill Road to the Stock Route, a pair of massive bright headlights turned onto the road from behind us. Naturally, we got off the road, which meant disappearing into the thick patch of trees between the road and the brothers' property. As the lights caught up to us, the vehicle started slowing. Up until then, we had thought it was a farmer's ute, but now we realized it was a very old, very loud tractor. Not wanting to be questioned by any meddling adult, I tried to encourage the guys to hide. The tractor slowed right down and flashed a spotlight into the trees and then sped away. The guys asked me who it was, and I said I didn't know. As we continued walking slowly, we saw the tractor turn around the Stock Route and then into the brothers' property. Now I was unnerved. The tractor came roaring down the fence line, and I yelled at the guys to run. We ran until we came to a small, well-hidden ditch, which we jumped in and lay very still. The tractor stopped right on us, and they shined the spotlight over the trees. It didn't illuminate the ditch, luckily. The driver stopped and got off the tractor, walked over to the fence, and I peered up and saw the silhouette of a dirty, disheveled man with messy hair standing at the fence line looking around. In his hands was a rifle. In a nasally, Aussie, hillbilly voice, he yelled out, "Where are you?" We didn't dare move. I started thinking what we'd have to do if he climbed the fence and started coming our way. But he eventually turned around, got back on his tractor, and left. It started with a groan and then rumbled down the other way. I got my friends up, and we sprinted towards the Stock Route, ducking under branches and jumping over fallen trees. We hadn't quite hit it when the headlights were behind us again, roaring up Sawmill Road. We made it to the road and panicked. It was still 2 or 3 miles back to the camp, and we wouldn't be able to outrun the tractor. On the other side of the stock route was a state forest, with tens of miles of twisting dirt roads and motorbike trails and goat tracks. Despite how dark it was, with the strong possibility of getting lost, we dove in there. We hid as he went past us again, finding a forest road which led back to the general direction of town. We followed it for a while, wondering if he had given up, and if it was safe to go back on the stock route. Then he was in front of us, blinding headlights roaring down the forest road. We jumped back in the trees and decided to run. We ran straight past him. Behind us, he turned back on the stock route and chased us again. He circled us 4 times with us hiding, then running, then hiding, then running. When we had gone far enough that we thought we were close enough to the camp, we ran through the woods and jumped back on the stock route to be met by headlights. Tim's mother had come looking for us after finding our camp empty. She'd finally found us, and we were still a mile or so from camp. We quickly piled in and she drove us back. We told her what happened, but she and my parents just said they're weird people and to stay away from them in future. This happened to my uncle's wife. I will narrate it, how she did to me and my sisters. We're from the northern state of Mexico, Nuevo León, from a small town south of Monterrey, around El Cerro de la Silla. If you've never heard of it, do Google it, it's beautiful. Stories about people seeing witches and lechuzas around the town are very common, but my aunt's story really pulls a chill down my spine. The story goes like this. I lived in a small home up in the hills. I shared a room with my sister, our windows facing the main street. It was big, and it had rails on the window. One night, me and my sister were in bed. She was asleep, and I was awake, lying on my bed looking outside my window, since my bed was against the wall and right underneath the window. I liked opening the window and looking up at the sky. I remembered being around 3 a.m. when I decided that I had to get some rest. I stood up just to close my window, and that's when I saw her, the witch, flying right in front of my house. She saw me and we made eye contact, and I immediately shut my window and got under my covers and started praying. I eventually fell asleep and awoke to the fresh air hitting my face as I opened my eyes, and I see my head sticking out the window. I screamed as loud as I could, and my sister woke up to help me. I'd never been afraid like I had been at that moment in all my life, as I realized that it was only her power that caused me to look out my window like that. If it wasn't for the rails, she would have had me. My aunt told us that her grandma would tell that the witches would take kids out their windows at night, and she never believed her until it happened to her. She believed the witch wanted revenge because my aunt made eye contact with her. The crazy part is that until this day, she sometimes wakes up with random bruises or hickey marks on her skin. Well, that's her story. This happened a few months ago. I had just gotten Red Dead Redemption, and while I was playing online, I met this awesome guy named Rick. He's in his 50s, a retired firefighter, and we played together a while, helping me level up so that people wouldn't target a low-level player who is also a girl. After a while, he introduces me to this guy named Black Wolf Angel or something like that. He seemed pretty cool at first, this new guy. We would hang out on RDR, shoot lots of bandits, and do gang hideouts. After a while, we became somewhat good friends, and he then started to lightly flirt with me every once in a while. I let it slide, being the kind person I am, and I made it my goal to not get a so-called Xbox boyfriend, so I tended to avoid flirting on there. We would normally hang in parties or with Rick, but one time he invited me to a party and I'm like, "Oh, okay, he and Rick want to play." But I was dead wrong. He began to flirt super heavily with me, and I acted like I had to go, and I left. For weeks he would spam me with party invites and messages saying, "Hey sexy, I really want you." It finally got to the point where I was sick of him, so when he invited me the last time, I answered, and he started with the usual flirting, and I just said, "Look man, I'm not interested in any kind of relationship right now, so please lay it off."
No.
He agreed and stopped for a few days, but then he broke the silence by sending me a message saying, "I'm thinking of ending it all because of you." I flipped out on him and started to cuss him out and tell him to never contact me again. I told Rick about it all, and he told me he stopped talking to him a few days ago for the same reason. So for a while everything was cool, but then I started to get phone calls and text messages saying the same stuff he used to say. I answered one said call and told him to leave me alone or I'll get the police. Thankfully he stopped after that. So to the guy from Xbox Live, let's never meet again. You creep.
You know what I mean? She didn't think of blocking him.
When I was about 5 to 7 years old, I lived in a house with my brother and my dad, where we always saw spooky things happen.
The guy who raped her,
we thought it was haunted. One of the things my brother and I remembers from this house was a scary shadow. I was probably 5, and my brother was 2 years older than me. But I know this was not our imagination because we both remember the same thing. We were walking downstairs while my dad was in the shower, and my brother and I for a split second saw a large shadow behind the bar of a man who looked to be wearing a trench coat and a fedora. It disappeared right after we saw it. Another time our cousin had came over to the house for a sleepover, and he was staying in the hallway upstairs. He was right next to the steps. He was a few years older than my brother and I. He was perhaps 11 or 12 when this happened. But when he was trying to sleep, he heard creaks and ghostly noises. He also claimed to have seen a shadowy figure moving around downstairs. The figure was wearing a trench coat or fedora. In our time at the house, many people have sworn to heard noises from under the porch. My brother and I would never go into the attic alone, because we would hear things coming from the ceiling above my brother's room. I haven't been to the house in a long time now, and I'm wondering if we really were haunted by some spirits. I was in around 4th grade at the time. One of my teachers blew the whistle to let us know that recess was over, and we had to line up. The teachers did a head count and noticed that one of the students were missing, my friend Annie. Now, my school had a few trees on the playground making a little forest. One of the students noticed that there was a girl sitting under the tree. Everyone looked and saw the same thing. A girl with brown hair sitting under a tree, her back turned to us. Anne also has brown hair, so we assumed it was her. We all called for her, but she didn't move, and one of my teachers decided to go and get her. We all watched, waiting for her to fetch Anne, when I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was Anne. She explained that she went to get her jacket from the fence, which was nowhere near the forest. Everyone noticed she was there too, and we all looked back at the teacher who went down to get this girl. She was already walking up from the forest, no girl with her. The other teacher asked her what happened, and the teacher said, "I went down there, and I looked away from the girl for a second, and she was gone. There's no way Anne could have walked up from the tree to us without someone noticing. The trees weren't that dense, and we were all watching. Not to mention she came from behind us, where the jacket fence was." My elementary school was extremely old. To make matters worse, just a year prior to this, a man ended his wife's life just down the street from the school. They had 2 kids that went to this very school. I'm unsure what happened to the kids, but one of the kids was a girl that was in my class. But ever since that happened, we haven't seen her or her brother since. Maybe she perished and is now haunting the school. I don't know, but the memory of the ghost girl still haunts me. Norwich is an old medieval city in England and has lots of beautiful and interesting old places to visit. One of its most famous buildings is the towering Norwich Cathedral, opposite Tomland, which sits down by the River Wensum. Anyhow, busy exploring my new city one Saturday, I visited the cathedral, and after wandering the building, decided to explore the cathedral close. It was late, a sunny afternoon in October, with lots of autumn leaves on the ground, and I was really enjoying my walk when I stumbled upon a cobbled alley at the end of some houses, and decided to see where it led. The floor and walls were cobbled, and the walls maybe 10 foot high, so I couldn't see over them, but I could hear people in the gardens on the other side talking and children playing. Although I was on my own in the alleyway, I didn't feel alone. But as I began to walk on, the alley began to twist and turn, and although the sky was blue overhead and the sun was still out, I began to feel increasingly uneasy. I could no longer hear voices coming from the other side of the walls, and when I thought about it, realized that in fact I couldn't hear anything. No birds, no traffic, not even wind, and yet the cathedral is in the middle of a reasonably sized city. I began to feel nervous, and my scalp started to prick, and so I began to up my pace, telling myself that I'd been walking a while, and that the alleyway couldn't go on forever. But as I turned each blind bend, hoping to see the end of what was beginning to feel like a maze, I was only met with another stretch of alleyway. I began to jog, and although I hadn't seen anyone since entering the alleyway, and couldn't hear any footsteps on the cobbles behind me, I had the growing sensation that someone or something bad was following me close behind, and that the walls were pressing on. I started having difficulty breathing and realized I was also beginning to feel dizzy. I didn't want to pass out alone in this alleyway, and so decided to run. After what seemed like forever, I turned another corner and suddenly sprinted out onto a perfectly normal-looking street down by the river, and the city sounds returned. I realized I was shaking, my hand and forehead dripping with sweat, and didn't have a clue where I was. I sat down on a wall and had a cigarette, and pulled myself together, and then stopped a passerby and asked for directions back to the market square in the middle of town, from where I could find my own way back to campus. It didn't take long to walk back to the market square, but when I checked my watch, it turned out that I had been in the alleyway for nearly an hour. It didn't make any sense, as I couldn't have walked that far, but I didn't want to know too much about it, and told myself that maybe it was all the twists and turns the alley had, and that added to the time. At class on Monday, I was telling a few people about the alleyway in the cathedral grounds, and how it had suddenly turned really spooky, when one of the mature students on our course, who had lived in Norwich for years and knew a lot about its history, overheard me. She asked me if the alley was an old cobbled one with high walls that led off the cathedral close, and I said yes. She took me aside and quietly explained to me that she wasn't surprised I'd felt what I did, because that was the alleyway they dragged people accused of witchcraft along, before burning them at the stake, as Norwich has a huge history of witches. But the kicker to this story is that though I lived in Norwich for a number of years and often visited the cathedral, I never walked that alleyway again because of what happened, until that afternoon one day, when a friend from overseas was visiting. I took her down to the cathedral, and while there told her about the alleyway and what I'd experienced. She insisted that we walk it, and when I stalled and started to make excuses, promised me that if things started to go bad, we would just turn back, and she would stay with me at all times. Reluctantly, I agreed. The alley was just how I remembered it at first. Dry cobbled floor and high cobbled walls backing onto people's gardens. But after 10 minutes at most, and only a handful of turns, suddenly we found ourselves back onto the street. It didn't make any sense to me back then, and it still doesn't to this day, and I don't go near the Witch's Walk anymore. When Pokemon Go first came out, I couldn't keep up with my then girlfriend, now wife, at all. I'd spend hours walking around town, and somehow she'd always managed to outlevel me. So the only way I figured I'd get ahead would be to sacrifice my precious sleep and traverse and rough the tumbled streets of downtown Salt Lake City until the wee hours of the morning. And with that, my journey to become a true Pokemon master began. I started staying out until 1 or 2 in the morning 5 nights a week, since my work didn't start till around 10, and I felt I had enough time to recoup. And it worked great. Not only did I get ahead of her, but I developed a massive lead, made some friends, and even dropped about 12 pounds as well. Was working great, mostly. For anyone who doesn't know Salt Lake City, it has a pretty big problem with homeless people. A good number of them strung out on drugs or violently mentally ill. This isn't stereotyping, it's just a pretty well-documented fact, both statistically and from my own experience. It's gotten somewhat better since the state stepped in to clean up downtown, but at the same time, they were filtering up into the nicer areas of the city at night, and setting up camp or accosting people playing alone. As a result, I brought several knives which I would carry on me, one in my bag, and one where most people hold a wallet, one in my pocket, and yet another on my belt loop. I know it might have been overkill, but I wanted to be prepared for any situation. After all, I didn't need to win a fight, I just needed to make going after me not worth their time. And after getting sized up by a rather surly-looking group when I had stopped to use a public bathroom by the state capitol, I decided it would be better to stock up than to be undergeared. Thankfully, I've never had to do anything with them, but I have had to brandish it on more than one occasion. One night I'm walking back from the hill leading up to the capitol, when I see a guy on the same sidewalk a ways off heading in the opposite direction. At first glance, he seems harmless, but then I see him start twitching his shoulders uncontrollably, and realize he's probably tweaking right now. As he approaches, I can hear him talking to himself. Nothing intelligible, but I think I at least heard him say something about kangaroos are controlled by Interpol. I'd been focusing on listening to him, and hadn't noticed that he'd realized I was there. He began to walk towards me with that sort of purposeful stride that you have when homing in on someone. He was still probably half a block away, and I needed to cross anyway, so I figured that were a good time as any to part company. As soon as I'd stepped away and put my feet into the road, he follows suit and picks up the pace, making a beeline right for me. I unfasten it from my belt loop and palm it just in case. He's still shambling towards me, and I realize I've got one last chance to get out of this without conflict. When he's no more than 10 feet away, I flick it out, casually brandishing it to my side, and there's just enough light on me to make out that I'm armed. The guy stops in his tracks and just walks back to his side of the road as I continue my walk to the throng of people gathered at a small park with 4 stops all lured up in the hope for a Dragonite spawn. Sadly, that sort of dedication following such a creepy encounter didn't endear me to the gods of Pokemon Go enough to grant me one that entire summer. I freely admit that I could have been completely wrong about his intentions, but I wasn't willing to take the risk. Thankfully, I've never had another run-in like that again, even on subsequent nights when I went out binge playing until the deep freeze of winter arrived. I've had some really weird encounters with homeless people, including an overly aggressive panhandler who tried to come inside my apartment, and someone who thought walking in front of my car at a green light to keep me from going so he could beg for a ride to court, and I'm not joking with this, was good. But nothing where I actually felt my life was in danger like that night. In fact, my backcrap insane stalker ex scared me more than the homeless do. However, that's an entirely different story for another day. So, crazy guy, let's not meet again.
Shut the fuck up.
I was living in Australia for a year. I was once a passenger carrier travelling through towns to get to the next destination. We were passing through rural towns in New South Wales that are small but still well populated. We passed by a field/park where families are having picnics, enjoying the day, kids running around and playing. While I'm looking at the park and all the people in it with my head on the window, I all of a sudden see what looks like a grey zombie walking through it. It's walking right by families and people sitting down, but no one seems to take notice of this thing that's sticking out like a sore thumb. No one is looking up at what I assume is a freak in a Halloween costume when it's not Halloween. It's moving slowly and limping like a zombie would, but has a dead look in its eyes and its skin is grey. If my memory serves me correctly, even its clothes are grey. It's wearing tattered clothes and has a Frankenstein monster kind of air about it. That's the best way I can describe it. Like a grey zombie Frankenstein monster. My eyes follow it the entire time while my bus passes the park, which is only for a moment. But the thing that freaks me out the most is how it's passing by all these families and no one is paying any attention to it. The thing is, it didn't necessarily seem evil to me, just sad. It didn't make eye contact with me. It was just walking slowly and sadly through the park. This huge grey guy is dressed up as Frankenstein's monster, painted grey on this sunny day, and no one even took notice of him. I don't know what to make of it. A very short 10-second psychosis on my part, or something supernatural. I also wanted to share this with you to see if any other Aussies know any legends that resemble what I saw, or if anyone has had a similar experience, because I can't explain this strange humanoid and can't find anything similar regarding this encounter. This happened when I was around 1st to 3rd grade, which is approximately around 10 to 12 years ago. But this specific memory has permanently scarred me until now, and is most likely the reason I am no longer a religious person. In the Philippines, the majority of our schools are Catholic. Some private schools require students to go to church every first Friday of the month. The school I went to back in elementary was one of those. Basically, every first Friday of the month, the students would gather in their respective classrooms. First, before all of us would be led to the church, and the church we went to was connected to our school. Each grade and section had their own areas in the church, so our teachers would be able to monitor us. The pews my classmates and I sat on were around 10 rows away from the altar, so it was pretty close to the front. The nuns and other church staff usually sat at the 1st to 3rd rows. I'm not sure if churches in other countries do this, but at the end of the ceremony here, people clap in celebration after hearing Mass. I was sitting next to my close friend, and we decided to do something funny. We were around 8 at the time, so our decision-making skills weren't really the best. While the priest was saying the final blessing before ending the Mass, my friend and I decided to clap. It was only one clap, but it was a loud one. The sound echoed in the church loud enough to catch the nuns' attention. Finally, the Mass ended, and the students were led back to their classrooms, except our row. Enter the nun. She was old, between 60 to 70, wearing a black habit, and was very wrinkly. She marched towards our area fuming, and started demanding as to who made the clap noise. I ended up admitting it was me, but my friend didn't, so it was only me who got into trouble. The nun told my advisor to let me stay in the church, and my teacher obliged, gathered the rest of the students, and left. I was alone at this point, and bawling. The nun went off somewhere, and I was a small 8-year-old child who was left alone in a big church, aside from the janitor, who was cleaning the floors. Chills were literally running through my body. How would you feel if you were left alone with all these scary statues looking down upon you? The atmosphere felt really creepy and eerie. The design and architecture of the church was Gothic, so it only fueled my fear further. When the janitor began to clean near my area, I was begging him to let me out of the church, but he refused, stating that he was only following orders. Eventually, the nun comes back for me, grabs my wrist harshly, and tugs me out of the church and into their sleeping quarters. Quick note, in private schools in the Philippines, nuns and priests were residents and had sleeping quarters within campus. While the nun literally dragged me to their sleeping quarters, I grabbed onto a ledge near the gate, still screaming and thrashing around. We were outside this time, and the nannies and other guardians of the other students were looking on, but none of them did anything to intervene. I spot my nanny from afar and can see her looking at me in concern, but she stayed rooted to her spot. Once we were inside the nun's sleeping quarters, she throws me to the bed and begins yelling, telling me what I did was wrong and that I have sinned, and threatened me that she would lock me up in her room for a week. She even locked her door for emphasis. I was beyond scared at this point. She looked at me in the eyes and asked me if I would do it again, shaking her finger in my face. I shook my head furiously, and I remember her reiterating that she'd keep me in her room, but for only 3 days this time. I told her I would never do it again, and after what seemed like hours, she finally let me out. I was shaking when I returned to the classroom. We didn't really do anything to report the incident. I'm not sure if my nanny told my parents what happened, but if they did, they didn't come forward to file a complaint. So to this day, while entering that church, I still get goosebumps. My family gets very annoyed at me when I don't go to church on Sunday, but at this point, I really don't care. My family and I moved into a new house, which is a 2x4 house. It used to have an attic, but has since been sealed off. After a few months of living in this house, sometimes I'm just watching TV and hear scratching from the roof. I just play it off as being a bird. They're common where we live. And 3 weeks after the scratching, it got worse and more frequent. It's almost as if it were trying to scratch its way out of the roof. The attic entrance is above the outside of my sister's room, and one day my sister tells my dad the seal was open. My dad gets confused because it was supposed to be sealed off, so my dad goes to close it and realizes that it's really hard to open and close, so whatever opened it was strong. That's when I start to get skeptical. The same night I go to get a snack from the fridge. I open it to find out that they're gone. I think my sister must have eaten it.
Cool.
In the morning, my parents are going on about a missing cake. The cake was supposed to be for my niece's birthday. They ask if I had anything to do with it, and I say no, along with all my other siblings. I was getting very suspicious about the attic, so I built up the courage to go check it out. Please note, I am also probably the most paranoid person on this earth, so I was scared for my life, but the curiosity got the best of me. I get the ladder, a torch, and a knife just in case. I open the hatch. I shine my torch inside to see nothing. But as I search, I see the cake, empty snack pellets, dirty clothes, and a short, dark silhouette. It just freezes on the spot, and I immediately bolt and scream for my parents and tell them everything. They tell me to go stay in my room, and when they go and check it out, it was gone. I'm still in shock from that moment and get nightmares from it. We have since moved and no longer live anywhere near there. This happened in Manitou Springs. My wife and I at the time had a long commute between work and our home. We drove to the city in the daytime, came to our apartment in the evening. We had our youngest daughter at the time, and were unloading some groceries. My wife saw from the corner of her eye a figure approaching. It was bizarre for her to get defensive, since many tourists walked the roads we lived on, Rutan Avenue. She took our daughter inside right away, fearing something amiss. She came back out to help me, and told me she felt weak all of a sudden, and started pointing at this lady walking up the hill. She noticed the person did not look like someone she wanted to be in the presence of, and fled inside immediately after seeing what they looked like. I, however, stayed, not knowing what I could make eye contact with. She looked homeless, which was common, as a lot of people come to Colorado for the pot craze. This was different. She had a burlapped sack, cut in sections, that almost had a weird aura, almost a memorization of confusion. Her face was scarred and deformed. She looked like she had a humpback, but possibly could have been carrying supplies. I made eye contact for the briefest moment, almost feeling an energy pushing me away. She had a staff too, and was walking very slow. I got chills, turned to grab the last of the bags, and as soon as I did, she was gone. I knew she would be there, and my curiosity struck me to see what this entity was. But she vanished, poofed into nowhere, one-way street with a river next to the road. I later went out to enjoy a cigarette that very night. It was 2 or 3 in the morning, very late, super dark, and no lights on the street. It was a hill, so I looked up the road and noticed up in the pass in the faint distance I could see colors changing, almost like a flame burning, but not the same colors. It was more purple, blue, and black. I still do not know to this day what this thing was. If it was a trick, it was well played. But the street had a very dark history. No doubt in my mind, this thing could have been a witch or demon of some sort. I moved in with my dad around the age of 11, and to help keep in contact with my brother, my dad helped me create an Xbox Live account. I made plenty of friends on Halo 3, Left 4 and Dead 2, and Resident Evil 5, and I had an amazing group of people that I am still friends with to this day. The group I made were much older than me with a few exceptions. Some of their kids were also friends, a part of this group, and one of them is actually a day older than me, so he and I became rather close. Overall, I made a lot of amazing memories with these people. But there was one problem. About a year or 2 into being involved with these people, a random person randomly rejoins the group. The person was a friend with one of them before, and the others were acquainted as well, but they barely knew them. I've never been great at making friends, as I'm quite awkward, and say a lot of weird things that makes people cringe in desperation, but I am nice and friendly. I added this mysterious person, but I was rather distant, as they didn't have a mic, and this person was also pretending to be a woman. When Halo Reach came out, every single one of us was on that game. We practically dominated SWAT, and this person would join in often. Communication was obviously limited because they lacked a mic, but it made it easier for them to pretend to be female. Now I do have a fairly deep voice myself, so a lot of people even now still think I'm a boy when I'm playing online. So my instant thought was that maybe this person was just self-conscious over how they sounded and just couldn't afford a mic perhaps. One morning, this person and I are both online. Everyone else was either still sleeping or at work, and it was a weekday. This person and I began messaging each other back and forth. It was pleasant conversation at first, which then turned dark. Mind you, this person was well aware that I was young and inexperienced in life. They began sending me sexually explicit messages, asking them to show me my 13-year-old breasts. At that moment I blocked the person. My buddy, who introduced me to the group and is well into his 30s, gets online and I tell him everything. It's obviously a little odd for such a young person to be friends with several people, a few decades older than themselves, but they all treated me like a little sister, and this became evident when I told my friends what happened. He immediately got defensive and starts messaging the mysterious man that was no longer allowed to join our group, as what he did was disgusting. As everyone in our group began signing on and joining the conversation, we put the pieces together and realized that 1, this person was a creep, 2, a liar, and 3, a man. They lied about not having a mic, and was caught with a mic at a few points during their time with the group. The person speaking was apparently male, and then lied about it, saying that the person speaking was her brother. There was plenty of other proof people offered up, but that one was one of the main ones I remember. This story dates back to July last year. It has enough weirdness that I find myself puzzling over exactly what happened quite regularly. My friends' reactions sometimes make me wonder if this is just a big old self-gaslighting experience. But yet, when I go over the details, there is enough deep weirdness that it only leaves 2 real options. I'll let you be the judge. A few years ago, my best friend Toby took a cross-country grand position in Brisbane, a big, tumulus thing for our group of friends, and amid the 3 a.m. power-drunk confessionals and promises to not lose touch, was a promise of the road trip. However, life found a way to make our drunk promises seem very disingenuous, and 18 months later, we'd hardly spoken barring a few crowded hours when he'd flown over for a family obligation. Eventually, the stars aligned mid-July last year, and myself, Toby, and 2 other friends, Chris and Alec, were able to get the band back together. Queensland is a weird mix of tropical paradise,